we just take a minute and thank Laura? I just love these songs so much. Well, good morning to everybody. I am Jim Lincoln. I am a worship associate, and I am doing the message this morning, sometimes called a sermon. So a church worship service devoted to folk music in general, and Bob Dylan in particular, might seem a little bit off the beaten path. But UUism as a whole is pretty much off the beaten path, so maybe that's okay. Where is that path anyway? And this is not the first time a UU church devoted a service or sermon to Bob Dylan. Stephen Falk, who I think I am citing over there on the left, actually did one here some eight years ago. It's great to have Steve here. And a little Googling will take you to any number of other UU churches that have done a Dylan service at one time or another. Now, this service is not just about Dylan, who is now in his 80s with a lifetime of huge accomplishments behind him and a long list of honors, the Nobel Prize, to name just one. It is also about Western folk music tradition, more generally, and the part it played in the social movements and cultural revolutions of the 60s. I don't have to tell you how much music and poetry, including song lyrics, matter to our UU faith and to our church and denomination. I can't imagine a church service without our gathering music, our hymn singing, Joanna's violin, Brett's piano, the choir and house band, special music by Laura, Mark tuning, and others. Music is so much of what we're all about. Music infuses reality with charisma and enchantment. It sort of takes the mundane, makes the mundane sacred. Poetry does the same. I'm a sociologist by training, and a core theme in classical sociology is that modernity brings disenchantment. The forward march of capitalism and technology secularizes cultures and institutions, purging them of sacred meaning. Detachment, alienation, meaningless atomization are among the consequences, all well-known ailments of modern life. But music, poetry, and literature, as well as spiritual practice and sacred ritual, have the power to restore that enchantment and charisma to some degree. Now, I want to talk about a music tradition, while still very much present in UUism, is not as prominent as it once was. That tradition is folk music. When I was coming of age as a UU in the late 50s and early 60s, the U.S. was undergoing a folk music boom. In Greenwich Village, in New York City, Boston, Berkeley, Ann Arbor, elsewhere, coffee houses featuring folk singers like Odetta, Tom Paxton, Dave Van Ronk, Joan Baez, and of course Bob Dylan were attracting large audiences and inspiring droves of young people to pick up guitars and banjos and join the hootenanny. I don't know how many people are familiar with that word. It kind of dates you if you know it. The folk boom was also manifest in the rise of commercially successful acts like the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul and Mary, later Chad Mitchell Trio, New Christy Minstrels, and so on. These performers were quite adept at adapting traditional folk songs to the tastes of mass audiences by singing with smooth and harmonically blended voices and polished acoustic accompaniment. Folk music, as Paul mentioned, was hugely present in the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 60s. Singers like Joan Baez leading people in protest songs like the wonderful We Shall Overcome became a fixture of mass demonstrations. Baez and Dylan actually sang together in the 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington led by Martin Luther King. That evoked some criticism. Why were these two young white people leading the singing of a national gathering that was really all about the problems of black people? Dylan took the criticism to heart and actually never again performed at an overtly political event. I didn't know that until recently. Now, for the truly dyed-in-the-wool folkies in the 50s and early 60s, the music that mattered was traditional roots music, old songs with many variants whose origin and authorship were long forgotten. Baez recorded these in early albums, and so did Dylan in his first studio album. I was one of those purists for a time. Drawing from books like ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax's Folk Songs of North America, I learned a lot of traditional songs and mostly disdained recent songs of known authorship. There were exceptions, like other folkies. I was just fine with songs written by Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, and before long I was viewing Dylan songs the same way. My first exposure to folk music came at a pretty early age. My Unitarian parents, my father a minister, my mother a religious educator, both liked singing and knew lots of old songs. We'd gather around the piano at home or the campfire on our many camping trips and belt out, "I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day." You all know that? And many others. Our parents bought us a wonderful book, the Fireside Book of Folk Songs, which I just happen to have with me. Might be a little hard to tell from out there, but it's a bit the worse for wear, you know. I think it was sometime in the late 50s we got this, but all kinds of traditional folk song classics and spirituals are in there. I was taking piano lessons as a kid, and I could plunk out some of the songs in this book on the piano. And then in junior high, I was given a cheap acoustic guitar, and I started learning chords. If you like to sing, all you need is like 2 or 3 chords to be able to do a whole bunch of folk songs. So if some of you are inspired to go out and get a guitar, do it with my blessing. But where I really got caught up in the culture of folk music, interestingly enough, was during my years as an LRYer. How many people here know what LRY is? Okay, a bunch of graybeards like me. So LRY is Liberal Religious Youth, and that was the high school group from 19 in Unitarianism. And interestingly enough, a quick tidbit, LRY was sort of the first union between Universalism and Unitarianism. There was one LRY and it spanned both denominations. This was before the merger in 1961. LRY was disbanded in 1981 by the UUA, the National Association for Excessive Rowdiness, for sex, drugs, and rock and roll, among other things. General uncontrollability. One of the things LRYers loved about LRY was that the adult supervision was really light, and we wanted to keep it that way, and man, we made the most of it. But there came a point, you know, the early 80s, Reagan is president, things are getting more conservative, so even Unitarians and Universalists sort of thought LRY needed to be a little more controlled, or gotten rid of, in fact. At every LRY get-together, both locally at the San Mateo and Long Beach church that my dad was minister of when I was in high school, and at the larger regional and national conferences for which LRY was famous, the guitars would come out and we all be belting out folk classics like, and I still remember a lot of them, gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside. And Worried Man Blues, anybody know that? Take the worried man, go with it. To sing a worried song, it takes a very worried man to sing a worried song. Lots of great songs. And then an LRY conference would always end with, "This little liberal light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little liberal light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." We still sing that song, but without the liberal, for better or worse. I think folk music is a really important cultural treasure, and I'm grateful that I had so much exposure to it when I was growing up and young. The songs put us in touch with the lives of ordinary working people, including enslaved and indentured ones. Their struggles through the centuries shaped the histories and cultures of Europe and North America. Many of the lyrics in the songs are cries of pain. They speak to the hard lives of miners, factory workers, farmers, sailors, laborers, trappers, hunters, and so on. They tell of the miseries of prison life. Will you wake up in the morning, hear the big bell ring, you go marching to the table. I do it in G, Laura. It's the same damn thing. Well, it's one on a table, knife and fork in a pan. And if you say something about it, you're in trouble with the man. Let the midnight special shine its light on me. Let the midnight special shine its ever-loving light on me, which is about prison life and chain gangs, really. The spirit, they tell you, prison life, warfare, sickness and poverty, exploitation and oppression, battles for union representation. Woody Guthrie, there once was a union maid who never was afraid of the goons and the kinks and the company thinks and the deputy sheriffs who made the raids. The spirituals, which I consider to be a subgenre of folk, my wife Carrie disagrees with me on that, but express longings for salvation in the afterlife as an escape from the hardships of this world. A strikingly high percentage of the songs recount the travails of women. Women in these songs are often impoverished, abandoned, and abused, made pregnant out of wedlock. Love, oh, careless love, you see what careless love has done. Abandoned by drunkard lovers, oh, it's hard, ain't it hard, ain't it hard? Or just murdered by menfolk, as in Tom Dooley, that the Kingston Trio made famous, and Banks of the Ohio, which Joan Baez sings beautifully in one of her recorded songs. So much of the appeal of folk music to us as UUs is that it speaks powerfully to our fundamental concerns with social justice, as I think Paul, again, reminded us of. When I graduated from high school in 1963 and set off that fall to UC Berkeley as a freshman, there were folk singers crawling out of the woodwork. The Bear's Lair, which at the time was a coffee house, not the bar it is today, in the student union mostly featured folk performers. Guitar and banjo-bearing singers took up residence all over Sproul Plaza, if you know the Berkeley campus. Cafes and bars around the campus mostly booked folk acts. A lot of these youthful performers were just tremendously good. I wasn't. But I loved the music and I kept singing and strumming in my spare time. Occasionally on weekend nights, a mandolin-playing friend and I would sit on the curb in Telegraph Avenue and sing folk songs. Passerbys seemed to like it, or at least amused, and we even met a few girls that way. So it was at Berkeley that I heard Joan Baez's singing for the first time. I had just gotten there, and I was in the process of moving into Barrington Hall, the co-op dorm on Dwight Street, when I'm hearing this beautiful ethereal voice floating out of an upstairs window. She was singing one of the traditional folk classics. I think it was, "Hush, little baby, don't you cry. You know your mama was born to die. All my trials, Lord, soon be over." That's a Roots song. Nobody knows the authorship. It's been around forever, lots of versions. Like many listeners, at the time, my first encounter with Bob Dylan songs were through the recordings of other performers. Peter, Paul, and Mary did a gorgeous version of "Blowing in the Wind." Joan Baez did a heart-rending rendition of "Don't Think Twice." I'm not sure it was more heart-rending than the one Laura just did, which had me tearing up. The Byrds, a few years later, did a soft rock version of "Mr. Tambourine Man" that rose high in the pop charts. These were all very polished, easy listening renditions of Dylan songs, very different from the old-style, rough-hewn way that Bob himself was doing them in Greenwich Village coffee houses. Now, when I first actually heard Dylan himself doing the singing, I could not stand it. I thought, man, who's listening to this guy, you know? What am I missing here? He can't sing a note. It's just scratchy, awful. Growing up, I'd been accustomed to smooth vocalizations and perfect harmonies. In high school, I loved the Everly Brothers. Okay, dream, 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 dream. And Jan and Dean and Buddy Holly and people like that who could carry a tune quite effectively and harmonize beautifully. I also loved the flawlessly executed versions of classical folk songs done again by the Kingston Trio, Peter, Paul, and Mary. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're gonna die, for killing a woman. Even Pete Seeger, who was less polished and authentic than Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary, had a very pleasant, tuneful singing voice. Dylan's raspy nasal vocalizations mimicked the crude, plain folks' vocals and mannerisms, chiefly of Woody Guthrie, but also other traditional folky, Odetta, Lead Belly, and so on. Surprisingly to me at the time, a lot of listeners really resonated with Dylan right off. You know, he spoke to them. They liked that sound. There was some authenticity to it that there wasn't in the songs of some of the other folk performers, particularly the more commercial ones. Robert Shelton, the New York Times reporter who discovered Dylan in Gerde's Folk City in Greenwich Village in 1961, praised, it was really an over-the-top review. He just went nuts over Dylan. The rude beauty and searing intensity of Dylan's vocals. Novelist and essayist and poet Joyce Carol Oates, always on the short list for the Nobel Prize, is a longtime Dylan fan, and she likens his singing to singing sandpaper. But with a dramatic and electrifying effect. And it wasn't just that Dylan's singing was rough. I mean, despite his Minnesota upbringing as a middle-class white kid, Hibbing, Minnesota, someone here was just telling me about Hibbing. He affected working-class grammar and diction. Okay, you know that if you've listened to any Dylan. Woody Guthrie was his hero and role model, and much of his early singing closely mimicked Woody. Irish folk singer Ewan MacColl, who does beautiful songs himself, criticized Dylan for his phony cultural illiteracy. Kind of like Elvis Presley's appropriation of African-American rhythms and blues music styles, Dylan was a master cultural appropriator of the vocal styles and mannerisms of the workers, farmers, hobos, and other plain folk that populated his songs. I may not have cared much for Dylan's voice when I first heard it, but I came around pretty fast. I came to feel that Peter, Paul, and Mary, and especially Joan Baez, who I just adored, beautiful as their singing was, lacked the folky authenticity that Dylan, following people like Guthrie, Dave Van Ronk, and others, had woven into his vocals and diction. His singing I was talking to Paul Damerow about that, his singing with guitar and harmonica in his second album, the first one that was a big commercial success, the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, I think is just about perfect. You know, if you don't know that album, you gotta listen to it. It's all acoustic. This is before he brought out the electric band and all that kind of thing. And those songs are just amazing. Don't Think Twice is one. Oxford Town is another. Talkin' World War III Blues is another. So one might say that Bob Dylan succeeded in achieving folk singer authenticity in a somewhat inauthentic way, studying naturals like Woody and copying their styles. Quite a bit about Bob Dylan actually smacks a bit of inauthenticity. It gets talked about a lot among Dylanologists. It's never been very easy to say just who and what Bob Dylan is, or has been. If you thought you had him pegged one day, there's a good chance that by the next he'd have morphed into something else, quite different. In 1961 to 63, for example, he became a successful folk singer in the old-style tradition and a phenomenally prolific writer of powerful songs that retained the feel and sound of authentic root music. He was cranking out like 30 songs a year in 61, 62, 63, 64. Just genius, unbelievable. But by 1965, with the release of his blockbuster albums, Highway 61 Revisited and Bringing It All Back Home, Dylan had morphed into something radically different. An electronically amplified rocker who had fused the tunes and styles of rock legends like Little Richard and Chuck Berry with extravagant poetic lyrics bursting with phantasmagoric and surreal images. Laura was singing Mr. Tambourine Man, and there are images like that there. The new lyrics were heavily influenced by beat writers Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, as well as modernist poets like Rimbaud. This was a dramatic break with his acoustic folk work just a year or two before. But, bear in mind, he had been I don't know if I mentioned this, but he had a rock band when he was in high school in Hibbing, Minnesota. The guy was a rocker. He was a rocker before he became a folkie. And when he was at the University of Minnesota for just 1 year before he decided this wasn't worth his time and set off to Greenwich Village, he was reading classical poetry and following the beats and all. So this was in his DNA by 1965. It was, however, extremely wrenching and painful for his folky fan base and the multitudes of young people who had anointed him prophet and spokesman for a generation passionately committed to social change and justice ideals. The much-chronicled watershed event revealing or dramatizing this transformation was the 1965 Newport Folk Festival in Rhode Island. Dylan brought on stage an electronically amplified, this was the third or fourth Newport Festival, 61, 62, 63, and he'd been a huge hit at each of those, but was all acoustic. But in 65, I think it was March of 65, he brings on this electronically amplified rock band as backup for his performance of Like a Rolling Stone. Give it a try. Once upon a time, you felt so fine, threw the bums a dime in your prime, didn't you? People call, say, beware doll, you're bound to fall. You thought they were all kidding you. You used to laugh about everybody that was hanging out. Now you don't talk so loud. Now you don't seem so proud about having to be scrounging your last meal. How does it feel? How does it feel? Be on your own, with no direction home. A complete unknown, like a rolling stone. Love that. I love that song. I love that song. I was actually working in construction, summer job after my first year of college in Burlingame with a contractor who was in the San Mateo church, and on the radio comes this song, Dylan singing Like a Rolling Stone with the organ and all that, and it just blew me away. It went 7 minutes, it just went on and on. But the images and the tunes I thought were just fantastic. Rolling Stone magazine, you aficionados will know, ranked Like a Rolling Stone #1 among all rock and roll songs ever. You can argue with that, but it was an important song for sure. But in Newport Folk Festival in 1965, a lot of the audience booed and walked out, not happy. Master of ceremonies, guess who? Pete Seeger, who had been a Dylan patron and supporter, was outraged, although he later said it was mainly because the amplified instrumentals made it hard for him to hear the lyrics of Bob's songs. So a large part of the strong reaction to Dylan's 1965 transformation to rock and roller was his substitution of electrically amplified instruments for acoustic guitar and harmonica. His past reliance on the acoustics had been key to his identity as a bona fide artist, and for many, the switch to electric just felt totally wrong and a betrayal. But another part of the abandonment and betrayal felt by his fans and followers after Newport stemmed from the shift in the content of his songs. The protest and the justice themes were much less clear-cut and not as prominently featured. Some began wondering whether Dylan had been cynically using folk music and justice causes merely as a vehicle to get ahead as a singer. For many of the Dylan true believers, this was just more than they could bear. There's a journalist that tells you something about Dylanology. A whole lot of people are happy to devote their entire lives to figuring out Bob Dylan. Elijah Wald wrote a 350-page book just on the reaction to Dylan at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. You'll want to run right out and buy it, I'm sure. In Wald's view, the timing of Dylan's transition from folk to rock coincided with a decline in the optimism and idealism that had so motivated the civil rights movement in the late 50s and early 60s. President Kennedy had been assassinated. The movement was splintering into more versus less militant civil rights groups. I remember this well, I was kind of involved in some of this and had friends who did. So, there had been MLK's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and of course the NAACP that had been around a long time. But then there were these newer groups like SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Stokely Carmichael, if that name rings a bell, and CORE, James Farmer, Congress on Racial Equality. And these groups were more militant, not as committed to nonviolent demonstration and resistance, and less receptive to young white activists, which was hard on a lot of the young folks at the time. Lyndon Johnson in '65 launched a major escalation of the Vietnam War. So Dylan's shift, in Wald's view, to hard rock sounds and surreal fantasy lyrics may have weighed more heavily on his devoted fan base at that particular juncture in time than it would have a year or two previous. I don't have time to go through all the reasons here, but I personally don't buy the idea that Dylan was just a cynic and he was using the social justice stuff and the whole folk song culture as a way of making it. I think his commitment to justice issues was pretty solid over his career. For sure, some of his albums have more of it, some of it have less. His most recent album, okay, who knows the name of that album? Rough and Ready Ways, has a song on it, which is the only song that ever made it to number one, only Bob Dylan song that ever made it to number one on the pop charts. Like a Rolling Stone, best rock and roll song ever, made it to number 3. Hurricane, which is a wonderful protest song, and his 1975 Desire, made it to about 30, I think. But this song about the assassination of Kennedy, which is something that shook Dylan way back in November of '63, and appears in various ways throughout all his songs. So Most Foul, which is kind of a talking blues style, recounts that assassination. It is very much in the vein of his early personalized classics like Hurricane, about the framing of the boxer Reuben Carter, Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. If you want to hear a really hard-hitting Bob Dylan protest song, justice song, there is that one. It's absolutely famous. About a black maid who was killed by a racist employer. Only a Pawn in Their Game, which is about the murder of Medgar Evers in the South. The Ballad of Hollis Brown, kind of a cry of rage about, anyway. There's much more about Dylan up through the mid-'60s that I'd love to talk about, the shift to colorfully imaginative poetry in his lyrics, the transition in the justice-oriented lyrics from angry denunciations of injustices done to individuals to more kind of allegorical treatments of loneliness, alienation, confusion, meaninglessness. These themes appear in a lot of his songs from 1965 on. Ballad of a Thin Man is wonderful on that. There's something happening here and you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? The social criticism in these later songs resonates with my sensibilities as a UU and as a sociologist. They reveal a Dylan who's still engaged and committed, I would say, but in a more diffuse and abstract way than in his early anti-war and anti-racist songs. I would also like to spend time just on the poetry in Dylan's songs. I said at the outset that poetry works to re-enchant and magically animate the routines of life that may be secularized and devalued by the forward march of capitalist modernity. It was for his poetry, really, that Dylan received the Nobel Prize in 2016. In the words of the Nobel Committee, the prize was for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. Dylan was a controversial choice because there was a long, long list of highly deserving literary figures who'd been working in more conventional literary modes, Joyce Carol Oates being one. I am pretty sure that the Nobel Committee tilted toward Dylan in 2016, in part because of the justice emphasis in his overall body of work, and also just the enormous magnitude of his impact on the culture. The committee has a history of considering things like this and making a choice. I think Dylan deserved his Nobel. He's a cultural innovator like none other. I still treasure and sing many of his songs, and I believe, as do a lot of people, that hearing them changed me for the better. Maybe next summer I can do a sequel sermon on Dylan's poetry and its roots in beat culture, Ginsberg, and I'm also a beat nut, by the way. I'd love to go to North Beach and get an espresso in Cafe Trieste and hang out in City Lights and that sort of thing. I've been doing lots of readings of the Beats lately, and it'd be great to have an opportunity in church to delve into their literature, philosophy, and music in some depth. Thank you all very much.